Before there was a United States, before any European ship had touched its shores, this land was home. For thousands upon thousands of years people lived here. They followed the great herds of bison across vast plains. They built homes in the cliffs of the desert southwest. They fished in the rich waters of the Pacific Northwest. These were not simple peoples. They were astronomers, engineers, artists, and philosophers. They developed complex societies and rich spiritual traditions. Their story is the first chapter of the American story, a foundation of time and memory etched into the very soil beneath our feet. They built cities that rivaled those in other parts of the world. In the Mississippi River Valley, the people of Cahokia built enormous earthen mounds that soared toward the sky, the heart of a bustling city filled with thousands. In the Four Corners region, the ancestral Puebloans constructed intricate stone dwellings, multi-story apartment complexes tucked into protective alcoves. These civilizations understood the seasons, the stars, and the earth. They created trade networks that stretched for thousands of miles, connecting diverse cultures and languages in a vibrant tapestry of human life that existed long before the idea of America was ever conceived. Then, from across the great Atlantic Ocean, came a change that would alter this world forever. In Europe, kings and queens were hungry for wealth, for new trade routes to the riches of the East. They funded brave and often ruthless adventurers to sail into the unknown. Men like Christopher Columbus were not looking for a new continent. They were looking for a shortcut. But what they found was something far more profound. They found a new world, teeming with people and possibilities they could never have imagined. This was not a discovery. It was a collision of two worlds, a moment that would reshape the destiny of both. The meeting of these different worlds was a story of wonder, but also of profound conflict and tragedy. Europeans brought with them new technologies, new ideas, and a powerful desire for land and gold. But they also brought diseases, like smallpox, that devastated native populations who had no immunity. At the same time, the brutal transatlantic slave trade began, forcibly bringing millions of Africans to these shores. They were chained and stripped of their freedom, brought here to labor and build the wealth of the colonies. Three worlds, native, European, and African, were now bound together in a complex and often painful dance that would define the American journey for centuries to come. Along the eastern coast, small footholds of European settlement began to grow into something more. 13 distinct colonies took root, each with its own character. In the north, towns and small farms dotted the landscape of New England, where Puritans sought to build a religious city upon a hill. Life was governed by faith, hard work, and the rhythms of the seasons. In the south, a different society emerged. Large plantations worked by the forced labor of enslaved Africans grew valuable crops like tobacco and rice. This system created immense wealth for a few, but it was built on a foundation of human suffering and injustice. In these colonies, people from all walks of life tried to build a new existence. A farmer in Pennsylvania, a fisherman in Massachusetts, a blacksmith in Virginia, they were all part of this experiment. They worked the land, built homes, and raised families. But slowly, something else was growing among them. It was a new way of thinking. They were separated from the kings and queens of Europe by a vast ocean. They were solving their own problems and making their own rules in town meetings and colonial assemblies. They were starting to see themselves not just as English or German subjects, but as something different. They were becoming Americans. This growing sense of independence eventually put the colonies on a collision course with Great Britain. The British government, burdened by debt from its wars, saw the colonies as a source of money. It imposed new taxes, on sugar, on paper, on tea, without giving the colonists any voice in the matter. No taxation without representation became the rallying cry. Protests erupted in the streets of Boston. Men disguised as Native Americans dumped tea into the harbor. The simmering anger was boiling over into open defiance. An idea was taking hold. That ordinary people had a right to govern themselves. Finally, the talk of freedom turned into the reality of war. In 1775, shots were fired in Lexington and Concord. A small group of colonial farmers and shopkeepers stood up to the mightiest army on earth. A year later, in Philadelphia, a group of remarkable men signed the Declaration of Independence. It was a radical document. It declared that all men are created equal, with the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The Revolutionary War was a long and difficult struggle, a test of will and endurance, but against all odds, with the leadership of George Washington, the colonists won. A new nation, founded on a revolutionary idea, was born. Winning the war was one thing, building a country was another. The new United States was a fragile and disjointed collection of states. The first attempt at a government was too weak to hold them together. So, the founders met again in Philadelphia to create a new blueprint for the nation, the Constitution. It was a document of compromises, a brilliant design for a government with shared powers, checks, and balances. It created a president, a Congress, and a Supreme Court. It was an attempt to forge one nation, e pluribus unum, out of many one. This framework was a miracle of its time, a guide for a government of the people, but this new house was built on a cracked foundation. The beautiful words of the Declaration of Independence, that all men are created equal, did not apply to everyone. While the nation grew, expanding westward across the continent, the institution of slavery became more deeply entrenched in the South. Millions of African Americans were held in bondage, their labor creating the cotton kingdom that fueled the nation's economy. They were considered property, not people. This was America's original sin, a profound contradiction that haunted the nation's soul and threatened to tear it apart from the very beginning. The fight for freedom was far from over. The country was split in two. The North was becoming a land of industry, of factories and growing cities where slavery was slowly disappearing. The South remained a rural, agricultural society, economically and culturally dependent on the institution of slavery. The two sides grew further and further apart, arguing fiercely over power, territory, and the morality of human bondage. Every new state added to the Union became a battleground in this debate. Compromises were made, but they only delayed the inevitable. The division was too deep, the wound too severe. The House, as Abraham Lincoln would later say, could not stand. In 1861, the conflict exploded into the Civil War. It was the most brutal and devastating war in American history, pitting brother against brother, state against state. The war was fought to preserve the Union, but it became a struggle for the very soul of America. With his Emancipation Proclamation, President Lincoln transformed the conflict into a war to end slavery. After 4 long years of unimaginable bloodshed, the North prevailed. The Union was saved, and slavery was abolished. But the cost was immense, and the challenge of healing a broken nation and defining the true meaning of freedom for all its people had only just begun. After the Civil War, America began to change at a dizzying pace. The nation was stitched together by thousands of miles of new railroad tracks, carrying people and goods from coast to coast. Smoke-belching factories rose in cities like Pittsburgh, Chicago, and New York. New inventions, the telephone, the light bulb, transformed daily life. Men like Andrew Carnegie with steel and John D. Rockefeller with oil built enormous fortunes and created industries that made America an economic powerhouse. This was the Gilded Age, a time of incredible growth and innovation. The American giant was awakening, flexing its industrial muscle on the world stage. This industrial boom was fed by a new wave of people. Millions of immigrants poured into the country seeking a better life. They came from Italy, Poland, Russia, and Ireland, fleeing poverty and persecution. They crowded into teeming cities, taking difficult and often dangerous jobs in factories and mines. They filled the streets with new languages, new foods, and new traditions. They saw America as a land of opportunity, a place where they could work hard and build a future for their children. Their energy and labor were the fuel that powered the nation's incredible growth, adding new threads to the American fabric. But this era of progress had a dark side. While some became fabulously wealthy, many workers, including women and children, toiled for long hours in unsafe conditions for very little pay. The gleaming cities hid crowded, unsanitary tenements. Farmers struggled with debt as new technologies made it harder to compete. African Americans, though no longer enslaved, faced a new kind of bondage segregation and systemic racism, especially in the South. It was a time of great inequality, a reminder that the promise of America was not yet shared by all. People began to demand change, organizing unions and pushing for reforms to make society more just. The 20th century pulled America onto the world stage in a way it had never been before. The nation was drawn into 2 devastating world wars. American soldiers went over there to fight in the trenches of Europe in World War I. A generation later, they fought to defeat tyranny in Europe and the Pacific in World War II. These global conflicts transformed the country. The greatest generation mobilized for war, with factories churning out planes and ships and women entering the workforce in unprecedented numbers. When the smoke cleared, America stood as the most powerful nation on earth, a leader of the free world with new responsibilities and challenges ahead. The decades after World War II were a time of great prosperity for many Americans. A booming economy created a large middle class. Families moved to new suburban homes, bought cars, and enjoyed a standard of living their parents could only have dreamed of. This was the American dream in full bloom. Yet, beneath this comfortable surface, the nation's old wounds continued to fester. For African Americans and other minorities, the dream was still out of reach. They faced legal segregation, discrimination in housing and jobs, and the constant threat of violence. The promise of equality, made a century earlier, remained unfulfilled. A new struggle for freedom then erupted across the nation. The civil rights movement, led by courageous figures like Martin Luther King Jr., demanded that America live up to its founding ideals. Through peaceful protests, marches, and sit-ins, activists challenged segregation in the South and inequality across the country. They faced down police dogs, fire hoses, and bitter hatred. Their bravery forced the nation to confront its conscience. Landmark laws were passed, like the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, that dismantled legal segregation and opened new doors of opportunity. It was a second American Revolution, a fight to expand the meaning of we the people. In the years that followed, America continued to change. The nation wrestled with a controversial war in Vietnam, which divided the country deeply. It saw new movements rise, for women's rights, for environmental protection, and for gay rights. New waves of immigrants arrived from Latin America and Asia, once again reshaping the face of the nation. The Cold War, a long and tense standoff with the Soviet Union, finally came to an end. Then the digital revolution, with its computers and the internet, connected the world in ways that were once unimaginable, bringing both incredible opportunities and new anxieties. Today, on this day in 2026, the American journey continues. It is still a conversation between hope and struggle. The nation still grapples with deep divisions, with questions of inequality, and with the challenge of what it means to be an American. It is a place of contradictions, a land of immense wealth and persistent poverty, a beacon of freedom that still struggles with its own history. But America has also always been a story of renewal. It is a story of ordinary people who, time and again, have fought to close the gap between the nation's promises and its reality. The epic tale of America is not over. It is being written every day by every one of us who dares to dream of a more perfect union.